Hi students, this week we're going to be looking at the emergence of medieval Europe. And the story of medieval Europe is the rebuilding of society and civilization in this region of the northwestern Europe, especially after the collapse of society with the fall of the Roman Empire. And we're going to look first of all at the kingdom of the Franks. And so the Franks give their name to modern day France, and this is initially a kingdom that's pretty weak and pretty divided. However, it is strengthened by the leadership of Charles Martel. This man called Charles Martel became the leader of the armies of the Franks. He was able to defeat the invading Islamic forces at the Battle of Tours that we talked about last week. And this sets a boundary on further Islamic expansion. It enables this Frankish kingdom to survive. Charles Martel's son, Pepin, is crowned king over all the Franks, is able to unite them under his leadership, and he's crowned king by the Pope. And this is one of the first times that the popes had ever come north of Italy and into northern Europe. And this establishes a really crucial alliance between the papacy and the kings of France. That from this point onwards, typically whenever the medieval popes need an army to defend them, when they're under attack, they'll turn to the kings of the Franks, the kings of France. And typically, when the French kings need a boost to their authority, need some kind of affirmation, they'll turn to the papacy. So this is the beginning of an important alliance that is cemented by Pepin's son, Charlemagne. Charlemagne is very famous as a leader of medieval Europe, and he's first of all a great general. He establishes an enormous empire that includes parts of Spain, all of modern day France, all of modern day Italy, a lot of modern day Germany, and also reaches into Austria and Switzerland, and even as far east as Hungary. So Charlemagne is very successful in building this large empire, but along with building this empire, he also is promoting the recovery of learning. So these are two ways in which Charlemagne is trying to revive some of the achievements of the Roman Empire. Achieving military and political control and the stability that goes with that, but then also in promoting the recovery of learning. Charlemagne recognized that Christianity was going to be the crucial glue that could unite these different peoples together into a single culture, but he also recognized that in order to practice Christianity, typically you need to have some kind of education. You need to be able to read, you need to be able to read the Bible, you need to be able to understand the teachings of this religion. And so he sponsors a wide program of learning that from our perspective today, it's easy for us to say, well, it didn't educate that many people. But it educates vastly more people than had been educated or that were being educated typically in the centuries previously. And so this is really important for rebuilding education and literacy in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne is succeeded by his son Louis the Pious, and from this point onwards, this family will be called the Carolingians. They're being named after Charlemagne, or they're taking their name after Charlemagne. However, Louis the Pious, we're going to start to see the weakening of the Carolingians and the Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne and Pepin had built. And that's because Louis the Pious, who's Charlemagne's heir, has three sons, and they all fight with one another. And then there's a fourth son who's born to a later marriage who fights with the other three. They fight with their father. So the civil war and the kingdom or the empire ends up breaking apart into three kingdoms. And this is codified at the Treaty of Verdun. This is the point where all the sides agree this is how we're going to break up the empire. There's going to be a middle kingdom that runs through the center of Europe. And so the reason the Treaty of Verdun is so important is because it establishes the political boundaries for most of the rest of the history of Europe. And so you have this kingdom in the middle. It's kind of a weird shape. It's not going to survive, but it's going to get broken up into lots of little pieces that today correspond to modern day European countries like Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and Italy. And then to the east, you're going to have another kingdom, the Eastern Carolingian Kingdom, and that's going to largely represent it's largely going to become modern-day Germany. And then to the west, you're going to have the Western Carolingian Kingdom, which is largely going to correspond to modern-day France. So this is why the Carolingians are important. They established the modern-day political boundaries of Europe in large part, and they revive the study of learning. They revive education in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, and they promote Christianity as a way to bind or unite all these different peoples in Europe together into a single unified culture. Now, with the division of the Carolingian kingdom, we're going to see more instability on the horizon. So the Carolingians provide an important precedent, lay important foundations for the development of this society, but the initial years after the division of the Carolingian Empire are pretty tough. That's because we're going to see new groups of invaders coming into Europe. So the first group are the Magyars. They're coming from the east. They're coming from modern-day Russia through Hungary and into eastern Germany, devastating and pillaging villages. But even more devastating than the Magyars are the Vikings. The Vikings very famously come from Scandinavia. They're great warriors. They're great pillagers. They come from, and their raids are basically random. And no one in Europe seems to be able to resist them. And they especially devastate the Western Carolingian kingdom, modern-day France. Why is this? Well, if you look at the map on the PowerPoint for this week, you'll see that modern-day France has a long exposed coastline. Two, actually, one in the west and one in the north. And so this means that there are multiple avenues where the Vikings can attack and be successful. And this, the threat of Viking raids, because this was very frightening and very dangerous for people at the time, the threat of Viking raids contributes to the further breaking up of the Carolingian Empire. So you divided it into three big chunks, and the Eastern Kingdom is going to largely remain intact. But the Western Kingdom is going to further divide into lots of little principalities ruled over by dukes and lords. And the reason this happens is because people need more of a local presence in order to respond to the Viking rulers. If you have one king who's trying to govern all of France, he doesn't know where he's supposed to be in order to protect his people from the Vikings. Vikings can show up anywhere, and they move much more quickly because they're moving by sea. And so for people living in this region, it becomes more important to have a local ruler who's more powerful and more independent and who can defend you if the Vikings attack your region or come raiding in the lands where you live. Unfortunately, the consequence of this is that these local lords become really powerful. And there's no one anymore who can maintain a centralized authority. And instead, what we see is that these local lords, when they're not fighting the Vikings, are also happy to be fighting against one another and devastating each other's lands. And this means that Europe in the 10th century, especially this part of Western Europe in the 10th century, is a very dangerous place. There's lots of fighting and pillaging and killing, and some of it's pretty indiscriminate. And so this is a pretty violent and unstable society. There's also supposed to be a Christian society, and so people start to look around the society and say, how can it be possible that we have a Christian society that is so violent and so lawless? And they decide that the reason that this has happened is because the church has become too closely identified with the state, too closely controlled with the state. And so this leads to a movement to separate the church from the state, to kind of purify the church by getting it away from control by secular rulers or state rulers. And this leads to the creation of a very famous abbey, the Abbey of Cluny. And so here we have the development of European monasticism, and it's developed as a way of making society more religious, and less violent, and more civilized by removing the influence of the state and secular rulers from the church. And so this is the way in which the leaders of this movement hope to improve and to rebuild their society. The implications of this we'll be looking at next week.